We continue now at the top of Daf Zayin Amid Beis in Meseches Menachos. This is Menachos Daf 7b. On the previous summit, they asked Rav Sheshes, can one take the komets from a vessel that is on the karka, that is on the ground? And the Gemara is in the middle of bringing a proof from a Mishnah. This is a Mishnah later on. It's talking about taking the bazichin, removing the bazichin, which are the spoons that have the levona, that have the frankincense by the lechem aponim. So they're removed from the table. This is every Shabbos. And the Gemara now continues its proof. V'ilu magbia es hashulchan lo katani. It doesn't say anything about lifting up the table. Apparently it's fine that the vessel is on the ground. And Rashi explains, V'ilu magbia lo katani she'acher magbia hashulchan b'shas siluk habazichin. It doesn't say that somebody has to lift the table at the time they remove the spoons. Alma miklisha al karka. You see that from a vessel that's on the ground, hayu siluk bazichin, they would remove the bazichin. Uvazichin matir nes halechem. And so the bazichin, they would be matir the lechem, they would permit the bread. Kekometz shematir sa mincha, just like a kometz, just like the fistful that is matir the mincha. Again, it's the same basic idea here. There's an analogy between the bazichin, which are considered to be the matir of the lechem aponim, and the kometz, which is the matir of a karban mincha. The kometz mikri azkara, because kometz is called an azkara. Uvazichinami mikri azkara. Bazichin are also called an azkara. They're the same idea. They're a remembrance before Hashem. Dichsiv, as it's written, v'haisal lechem leazkara. The kometz matir shirayim lechol. The kometz is a matir that allows the remainder of a karban mincha to be eaten. Dichsiv hanoseres min hamincha meishe Hashem. And so essentially, the siluk bazichin is the same as the taking of the kometz. So we can bring a proof from this Mishnah. And again, it doesn't say anything about a requirement to lift up the table. And the Gemara continues and says, Lav Amra, didn't you say Hasam over there? And this is in reference to a Mishnah that was quoted on the previous Amud in regards to a very similar question. And we said over there that Mishnah, which doesn't mention Kohanim holding up the vessels, Seder Avodos Nakat, it was just giving the order of the Avodah of what one Kohen is doing. The fact that there are Kohanim holding up the vessels is irrelevant to that Mishnah. It's no proof that the vessels are necessarily on the ground. It could be there are Kohanim that are holding up the vessels. So Hachanami, so here also when it comes to the Shulchan, Seder Avodos Nakat, we're just going through the Seder of the Avodah of the Lechem Aponim. Maybe there is a Kohen that's holding up the table. Rashi explains, Seder Avodos Nakat, v'hagbah lav minhu avodos, chashuvosi. Hagbah, the lifting up of the table, is not an important avodah, and maybe that's just being left out. And so essentially the same answer we gave on the previous Amud with regards to a similar question again, and they had a proof from a Mishnah. So over here also we'll give the same basic answer. But the Gemara says, Mi Dami, can you really compare the two Mishnayos? Hasam over there, Lo Naches L'Minyana de Kohanim. There's no mention of the number of Kohanim. But over here, by this Mishnah, with regards to the Lechem Aponim, Naches L'Minyana de Kohanim, the Mishnah actually is counting the number of Kohanim who are involved. And so Emisa, so again, if it's true that the Shulchan has to be lifted up, Lisni Magbia, it really should say that there's a Kohen involved in lifting up the table. Ela Shma Mina Komsen Mikli Shal Gabe Karka. Rather, don't we see from here that the Kmitza can be taken from a vessel that's on the ground, just like over here the Bazichin are taken and the Shulchan is on the ground. And the Gemara says, Shma Mina, indeed we do see that this is the case. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rava says, Pshita li, it is obvious to me. Kometz miklisha al gabe karka, one is allowed to take a kometz from a vessel that's on the ground. Shakain matzino basiluk bazichin, as we just said, that's what we find by the removal of the spoons by the lechem haponim. And mekadshin mincha beklisha al gabe karka, one can also sanctify a karban mincha in a vessel that's on the ground. Shakain matzino basida bazichin, that's what happens when the spoons are arranged by the lechem haponim. But the question is as follows. Boy, Rava asks the following question. Kiddush kometz, when it comes to the sanctification of the kometz in a vessel, the kometz is placed in a vessel, so what's the halacha over there? Mi mincha yalfinan la, do we learn that from the karban mincha? O midam yalfinan la, or do we learn that midam from the blood, from talking about animal karbonos, by the blood of animal karbonos? And Rashi explains Mekadshin Mincha. Again, this is when it comes to Mekadshin Mincha, according to Rava, it's obvious that it can be a Klisha al Gabe Karka, meaning Kishemevia mi Beso, when he's bringing the Kar Mincha from his house, Nosna Beklisha al Gabe Karka, and can put it in a vessel that's on the ground. Shekain Matzino Besidra Bazichin, and that we find by the arrangement of the Bazichin. Shemesader Halechem Shu Shirayim. They arrange the bread, which is considered essentially the Shirayim, like the remainder of a Kar Mincha. Uvazichin, and the Bazichin again is the spoons of the Levona, Shein Kometz, that's the equivalent of the komets. Al hashulchan shal gabi karka. They arrange that on the table, which is sitting on the ground. Dahainu dumya de mincha. That's similar to a carved mincha. Kishemevia mi beisa, when he brings it from his house. Demu ravan yachad hakomets v'hashiram. At that point in time, the komets and the shirayim are all mixed together, and so we can compare the two. But the question is, kiddush komets mai. What about the sanctification of the komets? To lo eshkechan bebazichin, because we don't find an analogy there by the bazichin. Kishu mesalkon, when he removes them. Dahainu kmitza. The removal of the bazichin is the equivalent of the kmitza. Sheyei nos no l'sham kli. He doesn't put it in any vessel. Elamiyan maktiru. He just immediately burns it. Hilkach leka lemifshad kiddush komets mehasam. So we can't learn from over there the sanctification of the komets. And so the question is again, what do we learn that out from? Do we learn it from mincha? Or do we learn it midam, mikabolas dam? That means to say, do we learn it from the receiving of the blood? T'chsiv, it's written in the pasuk v'ikrivu b'nei Aaron. It says the b'nei Aaron bring it. V'yamrina b'Torah's kohanim v'ikrivu zu kabolas adam. We say in Torah's kohanim that v'ikrivu is a reference to the receiving of the blood. V'kiddush komets keneged arba avodos shel dam. And again, we have an analogy over here: the sanctification of the komets. We can compare it to the various avodos of the dam. Kemitza, the actual taking of the fistful. Keneged shchita, that is the same as the shchita of the animal, the slaughtering of the animal. V'kiddush komets, and then the sanctification of the komets in a vessel, keneged kabbalah, that's the equivalent of receiving the blood in a vessel. V'holacha ki holacha, then you walk it over, that's the same as the walking over of the blood. V'haktara keneged zrika, and the haktara is keneged the zrika, the throwing of the blood. And so therefore we should learn it out from the dam, and the idea over there is that by the blood, as we're going to see, it has to be in a vessel that is not on the ground, it is being held by the Kohen, and so therefore over here as well, maybe it has to be held by the Kohen, or no, we learn it from the Karva Mincha, as we saw with regards to the Karva Mincha in general, the vessel can be on the ground, so maybe that's true by the Kiddush Komets as well. And the Gemara continues and says, Hadar Pashta. So then again, Rava asked this question, do we learn it Yalfinan La from Mincha or Yalfinan La from the Dam? Hadar Pashta, then he answered the question as follows, Midam Yalfinan La. We learn it from the Dam, we learn it from the blood, and therefore it's not allowed to be on the ground. And the Gemara continues, but does Rava really say that? But it was stated, the following machlokas amoraim, komets shecholko b'shnei kelim. What about a komets which was divided among two vessels? Rav Nachman Amar, Eino Kadosh. Rav Nachman says, it's not holy, that's not good. V'Rava Amar Kadosh. Rava says that it is sanctified in such a case. Now, v'im isa, now if it is true that he learns from blood, so leilaf midam, he should learn from blood, because by blood, also we understand by blood that it's not going to be Kadosh if it's in two vessels, and so it seems that he's not really learning from dam. And the Gemara says, Hadar be Rava me'ahi, that Rava retracted, meaning to say it certainly is not sanctified in a situation of two vessels, because we actually do learn from dam. He doesn't actually argue, Rava does not actually argue with Rav Nachman. And Rashi explains, Umi amar Rava hachi demidam yalfinan, does Rava really say that we can learn from blood? Because again, by two vessels, leilef midam, we should learn from blood over there. V'dam lo kiddush lechatzoin, by blood it is not sanctified in halves, meaning if it's in two vessels. Im kibel shiur hazos, the dam asham damporim, usirim hanisrafim b'shnei kelim. Rashi specifically pointing out the cases of blood where it's more than just a tiny amount, where you actually have a minimum requisite amount of blood that's needed, and if you take that minimum amount and you put it in two vessels, lo asa klum, so that's nothing. Kedamrin lekamanas, we'll say later on. And the Gemara then said that he retracted me'ahi from that. V'adaino kiddush demidam yalfinim. We do really learn from dam, and therefore it's not going to be kaddish lechatzoin. It's not going to be kaddish again if it's in two vessels. Rava agrees with Rav Nachman in that regard. And the Gemara continues and asks, V'dam minolan de lo kiddush lechatzoin. It's been assumed that by blood it is not kiddush lechatzoin. It's not sanctified in halves, meaning again it cannot be sanctified in two vessels. How do we know that? From where do we know that? And the Gemara says, the Tani Rav Tachlifa ben Shol, because Rav Tachlifa ben Shol taught, Kidesh pachos michdei hazah b'chlizeh, upachos michdei hazah b'chlizeh. This is in reference to the mechatos, that's the waters of purification for someone who's tamei mei. So if he sanctified less than the amount required for sprinkling in this vessel and less than the amount required for sprinkling in that vessel, lo kiddush, it is not sanctified. So clearly by the mechatos we say lo kiddush lechatzoin. V'yiboilahu, and they had the following question, b'dam mai, what's the halacha by blood? Is that the same as by the mechatos? On the one end we could say hilchis, this is just a halacha l'Moshe misinai. Umehilchis lo yalfinan, we can't learn from a halacha l'Moshe misinai. It's a halacha l'Moshe misinai by mechatos. Maybe it only applies over there. O dilma, or maybe hasam my time over there by the mechatos. What's the reason? Because it's written v'taval b'mayim. It says v'taval b'mayim, and that's the source for this halacha. But hachanami haksiv v'taval b'dam, and here also it says v'taval b'dam, and so maybe it's the same halacha by dam. And the Gemara continues and says, V'itmar, and it was stated, Amar Reb Zreika, Amar Reb Elazar. Reb Zreika says that Reb Elazar says, Af bedam lo kiddush, the halacha is the same by blood, it is not sanctified, and so you see again that by dam lo kiddush lechatzoin. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rava, Rava says, Tanya nami hachi, we have a brisa like this as well. The brisa says, V'taval, and he dips v'lo maspig. It means to say that he dips v'lo maspig means he doesn't wipe his fingers on the sides, on the walls of the vessel. He has to actually dip his finger in the blood. And it says in the pasuk, bedam, in the blood, sheyehei bedam shir tvila meikaru, that the blood has to have enough, has to have the minimum requisite amount of tvila, of dipping from the outset. Again, here we see the idea that lo kiddush lechatzoin, it has to have the full amount. And min hadam, from the blood, min hadam shebe'inyan, that means from the blood, and the Gemara will explain exactly what this means, min hadam shebe'inyan. And the Gemara says, v'itzrich lemichtav v'taval, v'itzrich lemichtav badam. The pasuk needs to say v'taval, and it needs to say badam. The yikasav rachmana v'taval, if it just said v'taval, hava mina afa gavdelo kibel shir hazos, one might think, even if there wasn't the minimum amount of shir tvilos, rather, meikaru, even if there wasn't the shir tvila from the outset, even if you don't have the minimum shir, kasav rachmana bedam, that's why it says bedam. V'kasav rachmana bedam, hava mina filo maspig, and if it said bedam, one might think, even, again, if he rubs his finger against the wall of the vessel to get the blood, kasav rachmana v'taval, so it says v'taval, and again, that means that he has to dip it in the blood, and min hadam shebe'inyan, and then again, we said min hadam means shebe'inyan, min hadam shebe'inyan. What does that mean, lemu'ute mai? What is that coming to exclude? Amar Rava, Rava says, lemu'ute shirayim shebe'etzba, that comes to exclude, let's say there's a remainder of blood on his finger, that blood that remains on the finger is no good for doing the hazos, for doing the sprinklings. As the Gemara continues, Messiah lay, Rabbi Elazar, this supports Rabbi Elazar, Damar Shirayim Shebetzba Psulin, who says that the remainder, any blood that's left on the finger, is disqualified for the hazos. And Rashi explains, Kiddush Mechatos, again, if he sanctifies the Mechatos, that's the waters of purification, it has to be Kedei Hazor, it has to be enough for sprinkling, Kedei Sheyitvol Roshei Givolin V'yaza, so the Roshei Givolin can be dipped in and be able to sprinkle again. It has to be the full amount. We say Lo Kiddush Lechatzoin. Lo Kiddush, it's not sanctified. And the point is, V'yafal Pi Shechazar V'yirvu La'achar Kiddush Nasinos Mayim Ala Efer, even if he goes and mixes together, so subsequently it is enough, that's not going to be good. It has to be the sheer Hazah from the outset. And the Gemara then asked, Bedamai, what's the halacha by blood? We understand by Mechatos that it's lo kiddush lechatzoin. What about by blood? Meaning, im kibel midam seirim uparim hanisrafim shetuunim hazoya v'kibel shir gimel hazos b'chlizeh v'shir dalet hazos b'chlizeh mahu. Again, Rashi's quoting the various kinds of chatos where there's a large amount of sprinklings that need to be done. It's not just the smallest amount. So again, what if he has an amount of 3 hazos in one vessel and 4 hazos in another? Is that going to be okay, or it has to all be collected in one vessel? Amar Rava said, Tanya Davidam lo kiddush. We have a brisa that by blood it's not going to be sanctified. It does have to be in one vessel. V'taval badam. It says v'taval badam. This is talking about dipping the finger in the blood by the applications, by the carbon chatas, the applications of the blood. V'lo mesapig mekaneach etzbo b'dofnei hakli. He's got to dip his finger in the blood. He can't wipe his finger on the walls of the vessel with the blood. And bedam mashma shir dam meikara. It says bedam, that the full amount of blood has to be there meikara, as we said. And v'hiz min hadam shebe'inyan lekaman mefarish mahi. Again, we're going to explain what does it mean min hadam shebe'inyan. And again, the Gemara said, Hava amina afa gavdelo kibel shir tvilos kol hazos meikaro. One might have thought you don't need the full shir, the full amount. Uvilvad shei b'shas kol tvilo tvila kadei shir, as long as at the time of the dipping you have enough, but you don't need from the beginning the full shir. Again, so the pasuk says you do. Kasav rachmana bedam demashma sheyehi shir dam meikara. Bedam is mashma, you have to have the full amount from the beginning. And again, the Gemara then said, when it says min hadam shebe'inyan lemu'ute shirayim shebe'etz, but to exclude any remaining blood on his finger, meaning shetzarich litvol be'etzbo bein kol hazah v'hazah, between every sprinkling, between every application of the blood, he has to dip his finger. In other words, he can't use the blood that remains on the finger. Tahachi mashma v'hiza min hadam ha'amr be'inyan lamala v'taval ha'koyin be'etzbo bedam may also dam shebekli shetoval bo yazek kol hazos v'lo shebe'etzbo. It's got to be from the blood in the vessel, not the blood on his finger. And the Gemara continues, Amarle Ravin bar Ravada l'Rava. Ravin bar Ravada said to Rava, Amri Talmidcha, your students say, Amar Rav Amram, that Rav Amram said, Tanya was learned in a brisa, Hayamaza v'nitza hazam miyado. Let's say he's sprinkling, and then some of that goes from his hand, it goes onto his beged, it goes onto his garment. The general halacha is that the blood from a carbon chatas, if it gets onto the garment needs to be washed in the azara. And so the brisa says, Imad shalohiza, if it was before sprinkling, so ton kibus, so then the garment does need to be laundered. But mishahiza, but if the blood goes after the sprinkling, ain ton kibus, so then laundering is not required. Now the Gemara says, my lav is it not? Ad shalo gomar haza'aso, it means until he finishes the entire sprinkling. Umisha gomar haza'aso, and then from when he finishes the entire sprinkling, meaning, what exactly does this brisa mean? The Gemara is assuming what it means is that if he completed all of the hazos, so then the rest of the blood is not fit for hazah, and there's no requirement to launder the garments with that if that blood gets on the garments, because that blood wasn't fit for hazah. But as long as all the hazos are not completed, apparently any blood that gets on the garment, we're going to say that the garment has to be laundered. That seems to imply shma mina, that seems to prove to shirayim shebe'etzba ksherim, that the remaining blood, let's say on the Kohen's finger, is fit for application. That blood also can be used for sprinkling. If that blood gets on the garment, apparently the garment does need to be washed. Isn't that what this brisa means? And the Gemara says, no, not necessarily. Achalo yotzta miyadu, it just means before it leaves his hand, so then hazah ton kibus. So then again, before he did any hazah, kibus is required then. But umisha yotza hazah miyadu, but once he did the hazah, he did the sprinkling, the application, and the blood left his finger, v'nitzah mimashen nishar, and then anything remaining on his finger got onto the garment, so ain ton kibus. So that does not require laundering, and so it could mean exactly this idea that whatever's on the finger is not fit, is in fact not fit for hazah. And the Gemara continues, Eitzvei Abaye asks a question from a Mishnah. This is a Mishnah Meseches Para. Gamar milahazos, if he finishes the sprinklings by the Para Aduma, Mekaneach yodo begufa shel Para, he wipes his hand on the Para itself, because everything, including the blood, has to be burned. And so again, a similar kind of proof. Gamar in, if he completes everything, yes. Lo gamar lo, but if he doesn't complete everything, that doesn't apply, meaning he doesn't have to wipe what remains on the finger. It's only what remains on the hand at the very end. And so therefore that would imply if he's not wiping away what remains on the finger, then what's on the finger is fit for the hazos. And the Gemara says, Amarle said to him, no, Gamar mekaneach yado. It doesn't mean like that. It means when he finishes everything, he wipes his hand so that all the blood is going to be burned. And lo Gamar, but if he didn't finish, if he's in the middle, but mekaneach etzbo, he does have to wipe his finger. What's on his finger is actually not kosher. Again, shirayim shebe etzba, psulin, whatever's remaining on the finger is not kosher for hazos. But the Gemara continues and asks, Bishlama Gomer Mekaneach Yada Begufa Shel Para. Now I understand when he finishes everything, so he wipes his hand on the Para Aduma itself. The Chsiv, as it's written, V'saraf es HaPara Le'inav, he's going to burn everything, again including the blood. Ela lo Gomer Mekaneach Etzbo, but now we're saying that it means that if he's in the middle of the hazos, of the sprinklings, so he's got to wipe off his finger, but B'mai Mekaneach, but what is he wiping his finger on? Amar Abaye says, Bisfas Mizrak, he wipes his finger on the edge of the basin. K'nechsiv, as it's written in the pasuk Kiporei Zav, it says Kiporei Zav. The Gemara here is darshaning Kiporei like a language of wiping. The idea is that he wipes again Bisfas Mizrak. We'll take a look at Tosas over here. Tosas say, first Tosas quote Rashi over here, Eletzbo b'may mekanech, what does he wipe his finger on? The question is, what's the question? Why can't he just wipe his finger on the para also? So Kan Peirash HaKontras, here Rashi explains, Lefi shaya maza midama b'hara mishcha el pnei ol moed, he would sprinkle from the blood on hara mishcha, on the hara zesim, towards the ol moed, upara lefanav nisrefes la'achar sheyor min ahar. Now the para was burned after he went down the mountain. And the question of the Gemara is, V'hechaya yored ben kol hazav hazah mehara mishcha lekaneach beguf hapara, is he going to go down between every sprinkling? Is going to go down from the mountain to wipe his finger on the para? That doesn't make sense. That's the question of the Gemara. And again, ultimately, the Gemara answers he wipes it on the basin. Uvizvachim beperak tam chatas. Now, Tosas notes that Rashi has a different explanation in Zvachim. Over there, Parashi explains shalohaya yachal lekaneach etzbo beguf hapara. He can't wipe his finger on the para. Shalo yislachlech etzbo benimin. We don't want his finger to be dirty with the hairs of the para. And so various explanations about what the Gemara means over here. And Rashi explains Bisfas Mizrak. Ultimately, the Gemara answers Bisfas Mizrak at the edge of the bowl of the basin. V'hainu dekar leMizrakin Kiporei Zav. The point of the Gemara is that's why the Mizrakin are referred to as Kiporei Zav, B'Sefer Ezra and Sefer Ezra. Al Shem Shemekaneach Yado Bo. That's like a language of wiping, because again he wipes his hand on that. But the Gemara continues and asks, Umiyomer Rebbe Elazar Hachi, does Rebbe Elazar really say this? And Rashi explains, Umiyomer Rebbe Elazar Hachi, Af Bedam Lo Kiddush Lechatzoin. Does Rebbe Elazar say even by blood that it's not sanctified in halves? Is that really the case, that you need the full measure? V'itmar, but it was stated, Chavise Kohen Gadol, when it comes to the Chavise Kohen Gadol, Rashi explains, Chavise Kohen Gadol is Asiris Ha'efa. This was an Asiris Ha'efa, a tenth of an Efa, Shemakrivim B'chol Yom. It was offered every day by the Kohen Gadol, and it was offered half in the morning and half in the evening. V'al Shem Machavas Kroi Lo Chavisim. It's called Chavisim because it was a shallow pan. T'chsiv al Machavas B'Shem and Te'asa. It says that it's made al Machavas. And so by the Chavise Kohen Gadol, we have a Machlokas Amoroim. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Eina Kedusha L'Chatzoin. Rabbi Yochanan says it is not sanctified in halves. And Rabbi Elazar Amar Mitoch Shekarv L'Chatzoin, since it's going to be brought half in the morning, half in the evening. So Kedusha L'Chatzoin, so it is sanctified in halves. You don't need the full measure. And Rashi explains, Eino L'Chatzoin, again, it's not in halves according to Rabbi Yochanan. Shem Nosan Chatzi Isaron B'Chlizeh, V'Chatzi B'Chlizeh Lo Kiddush, V'Yatzel L'Chulin. If he puts a half Isaron in this vessel and a half Isaron in that vessel, it will not be sanctified. It will be Chulin, it will be considered mundane. But Rabbi Elazar says, since Shekreva L'Chatzoin, since it's offered in halves, Machatzisa B'Boker, Machatzisa Bo'erev, half in the morning and half in the evening. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Ches Amud Aleph.